They say Rome forgot him, but the truth is Rome learned from him. Caligula's face vanished from coins, his name scraped from monuments, yet the systems he built, the ledgers, the silence, the obedience, lived on. Power remembered how to turn family into leverage, how to make love a weapon, how to make cruelty profitable. Every name in those records was a life broken to teach a lesson, and the lesson still echoes. The most dangerous tyrant is not the one who acts on impulse, but the one who turns his madness into policy. Some torches never truly go out. The summons arrived at dawn, carried by 2 guards in imperial colors. Senator Gaius Varro was ordered to the palace for illumination duty, a phrase he had never heard before. No explanation was offered, only the warning that delay would be considered disobedience. By evening, he stood in a narrow marble corridor, the air heavy with the presence of armed men. One of them pressed a torch into his hands. "Follow," was all they said. Varro obeyed, his confusion deepening with every step. The torch was heavier than he expected, its bronze handle warm from another man's grip. They led him to the far end of the corridor, where a large door stood ahead. The guards took position without speaking. Only then did Varro notice thick iron bands across the frame, not just to lock it, but to seal it completely. The wood was reinforced in a way meant to contain more than intruders. He remembered the whispers in the Senate about Caligula's private pleasures, how his appetites had grown stranger each month. Most dismissed the stories as political gossip, but the eyes of those who repeated them hinted otherwise. Now, standing before this sealed door, Varro began to believe every word. His heart pounded in his chest. The guard beside him adjusted his sword belt, then spoke with flat indifference. "Hold it steady," he said, nodding at the torch. "The Emperor hates shadows." From behind the door came a faint sound, muffled but unmistakable, a voice, high-pitched, breaking between fear and pain. The iron band seemed to tremble with each noise that struck them. Varro's fingers tightened around the torch as the voices rose. He opened his mouth to ask a question, but another guard leaned closer and whispered, "It has begun." Then the first scream cut through the air. When Caligula first took power, Rome welcomed him like a savior. He smiled easily, spoke kindly, and made gestures that pleased both the people and the Senate. Taxes were lowered, soldiers received generous bonuses, and the city was entertained with long games and festivals. For a time, it seemed the young emperor would restore dignity to the empire. Then, only months into his reign, he fell violently ill. The fever lasted for weeks, and when he recovered, something in him had changed. The warmth in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold certainty. He began speaking of himself as a living god, above all mortal rules. Soon after, palace servants began to disappear. At first it was a kitchen girl, then a stable boy. People assumed they had run away, until bodies surfaced in the Tiber. The disappearances spread to those of higher status, a merchant's daughter, the young nephew of a general. The pattern was never spoken aloud, but everyone saw it. Those taken had some connection to anyone who displeased the emperor. Senators began to tread carefully, watching every word they spoke in the chamber. Still, no amount of caution could guarantee safety. One morning, the wife of a respected senator was reported missing from her home. Rumors raced through the forum, but no one dared ask questions. That evening, during a state banquet, Caligula entered with her on his arm, dressed in silk, eyes hollow. He introduced her not as a guest, but as new property of divine service, and the senators applauded. Caligula's appetites did not remain a private matter for long. What began as sudden seizures of individuals soon evolved into an organized system. To run it, he appointed a freedman named Helicon as master of pleasures, a position with the sole duty of finding and delivering men and women to the emperor at any time. Helicon had free access to every quarter of the city, his word backed by the Praetorian Guard. No home, no rank, no reputation could shield anyone from his summons. The process became disturbingly formal. New victims were recorded in imperial ledgers, the same way Rome documented grain supplies or tax payments. Their names were quickly replaced by numbers, and short notes were added: age, physical description, family status, and intended role. Categories ranged from general palace service to private entertainment. For those of noble birth, the loss of a name and the assignment of a role reduced them to pure property. Over time, Caligula's choices became less random. Strangers no longer interested him. Instead, he began to select from the families of political opponents, merchants who resisted his terms, or officers who questioned his decisions. The message was clear: challenge him, and someone you love will vanish. The ledgers grew in number and detail. A disturbing new column appeared, written in Helicon's precise hand: Special Imperial Attention. Those marked here would never see general service or be assigned elsewhere. Their fate was direct and personal involvement with the emperor himself. It was the most feared designation in Rome, for everyone knew that once a number entered that column, the person it represented would not return unchanged, if they returned at all. Caligula's next creation was the so-called Temple of Divine Service, a name meant to disguise its true purpose. The palace's east wing was cleared of its former offices and redesigned to resemble a place of worship. Marble statues of goddesses lined the entry hall, but their faces were recarved to resemble the noble women forced to work inside. Incense burned constantly, masking the reality of what happened beyond the first doors. Helicon selected 40 women at a time from the highest families to staff the temple. They were rotated in and out on a strict schedule to keep them alive long enough to be useful. Each was given a list of appointments for the day: senators, merchants, ambassadors, or Caligula himself, all under the claim that they were performing acts of sacred devotion. Refusal was met with public punishment, often in front of the others. Every man who entered was required to sign an official record of his devotion. The document listed his name, the date, and the woman assigned to him. 2 copies were made, one for temple records, another for the imperial archives. Men understood that these records could be revealed at any time, and that knowledge bound them to Caligula's will. The temple generated enormous income through fees and offerings. Some appointments cost more than a year's wages for a soldier. All of it flowed directly into the imperial treasury, enriching the emperor as he tightened his grip on the city. What few realized then was that the profit was secondary. The real value lay in the archives, a collection of signatures and names that, in time, would be used as weapons to control the entire Senate without drawing a single sword. Caligula's banquets became as feared as his summons to the temple. Senators attended with their wives, knowing that at any moment the emperor might single one of them out for a private audience in an adjoining chamber. The rest of the guests were expected to continue eating and drinking while the sounds from behind the thin wall filled the hall. When the woman returned, shaken and silent, Caligula would turn the moment into entertainment. He would invite her husband to offer a critique of her performance for the benefit of the room. Some tried to speak vaguely, others attempted false praise, but all knew there was no safe answer. A response judged insufficient could result in immediate punishment. The most dreaded consequence was military discipline, guards dragging the wife away and subjecting her to further humiliation before the same guests. It was a lesson to the entire table about the cost of hesitation. Sometimes the emperor went further, asking other men present to compare the woman to their own wives or to past encounters. Laughter was forced, compliments exaggerated, but the humiliation was real and lasting. Every banquet was a public reminder that their private lives were now imperial property. Even those who had so far avoided direct loss could not claim innocence. Their participation made them part of the system. Caligula understood this perfectly. His next creation would strip away even the thin layer of distance these men still clung to, leaving them with no refuge from their own complicity. Torch duty was announced without warning. A father would receive a summons at dawn, ordering him to report to the palace with his eldest unmarried daughter. On arrival, the girl would be taken to a preparation chamber, while the father was handed a heavy bronze torch and led to a fixed position outside a sealed door. His task was simple: hold the torch steady so the emperor's divine activities would be well lit. Some called it a mercy. Torchbearers were not required to lay hands on their daughters, nor to speak, nor to cross the threshold. But the design of the chamber ensured there was no mercy in it at all. Small windows were placed at perfect height for the torchlight to pass through, and for the father to see everything inside. The girls, sedated but conscious, could see their fathers as well. The unspoken message was clear: your protector will watch and do nothing. The damage went beyond the act itself. Many daughters could no longer meet their father's eyes. Some fathers withdrew entirely from family life, unable to bear the memory. Others tried to explain, but what words could erase the image of a torch held steady while innocence was destroyed? Caligula quickly realized torch duty was more than cruelty. It was a political tool. Once a man had stood in that corridor, he would think twice before opposing any imperial decree. Every senator knew that one careless vote could bring him to that place. It was obedience enforced without chains or cells, a kind of control that reached into the heart and hollowed it out. And it gave Caligula an idea for the next stage of his system, one that would classify and process every victim before they were ever used. The evaluation chambers were plain, narrow rooms where new captives stood in a single line before a panel of scribes. Each was questioned as if she were a piece of property being assessed for sale. Age, height, and family connections were recorded first. Then came skills, language ability, musical training, household management, anything that could be exploited. The final and most telling category was family value, a measure of political importance. Every answer was written into two identical ledgers, one for immediate assignments, the other for permanent archives. Compliance or resistance was noted in the margins. A woman who stood quietly might be marked compliant, while one who hesitated or protested could be labeled resistant or unstable, ensuring harsher treatment later. The ranking system turned dignity into a liability. A high score meant youth, beauty, influence, and in Caligula's world, that was no blessing. Such women were rarely sent to general service. Instead, their files were set aside for the emperor's direct use, a slow-moving death of freedom and self. When the assessments ended, Helicon would collect the top files and place them in a separate folder marked with a red seal. Everyone in the palace knew what that meant, though no one dared speak it aloud. These women were bound for the newest addition to Caligula's machinery, a program designed not just for pleasure or humiliation, but for production, creating victims before they were even born. The breeding protocols began quietly, hidden within other palace activities, until they became an official arm of Caligula's rule. Women chosen for the program were not selected only for beauty, but for bloodline, health, and proven fertility. The aim was clear: to produce the next generation of servants, attendants, and entertainment for the palace, without relying on outside capture. Medical staff managed every stage. They examined each woman for strength, endurance, and past childbirth records. Those deemed high value were paired with selected men, sometimes soldiers, sometimes gladiators, sometimes other captives, depending on the traits. Caligula wished to combine. These pairings were carried out under watch, with details recorded: time, partner, and expected outcome. Pregnancies were monitored closely. Special diets were ordered, movements restricted, and medical checks scheduled. Nothing was left to chance. When the children were born, they were immediately taken for classification. Boys with strong builds were marked for military training. Those with softer features were set aside for more personal palace service. Girls considered attractive were enrolled in preparatory programs for future divine service, while others were placed into household labor. This classification happened before the child could walk, sealing their fate for life. Mothers rarely saw them again after weaning. Some women tried to resist, starving themselves to prevent pregnancy, using hidden herbs, but discovery meant punishment and forced feeding until conception was achieved. In time, one group of children began receiving special attention from the start. They were removed to a separate wing, dressed in silks even as toddlers, and trained in unusual ways. Their preparation was not for labor or the army, but for a transformation that would strip away their very identity before they reached their teenage years. The boys selected for transformation were almost always from noble families, often the sons of men who had fallen even slightly out of favor. They were taken without warning, brought to the palace, and stripped of their clothing and personal possessions. Their Roman names were erased from every record. In their place, they were given feminine names or flower titles, chosen to amuse the court. The training began immediately. Hair was grown long and styled, faces powdered, and bodies dressed in fine silks that left no doubt about their intended role. Servants drilled them daily in walking with grace, speaking in a higher tone, and performing delicate gestures. Any trace of their original posture or voice was punished, sometimes with isolation, sometimes with public humiliation. These boys served as female attendants in the palace, pouring wine at dinners, entertaining guests, and, in some cases, being kept for more private purposes. They were constantly reminded that their former selves no longer existed. Each week, a presentation platform was set up in one of the larger halls. The boys stood in a line while patrons, senators, merchants, or military officers seeking favor walked past and inspected them. A choice was made. Fees were paid to the treasury, and the boy was assigned for service. It was during these presentations that the cruelty reached its peak. Even senators who had obeyed every order could find their own son among the offerings, painted and renamed, looking at them without recognition or with silent pleading. It was a final proof that in Caligula's Rome, no loyalty was safe enough to protect a family, and no father could be certain that tomorrow he wouldn't be paying to reclaim what he had already lost. Caligula's claim to divinity was not a passing boast. He built policy around it. To justify the most forbidden acts, he turned to Roman mythology, pointing to Jupiter, king of the gods, who took his own sister Juno as wife. If it was divine for Jupiter, Caligula argued, it was divine for him. His three sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were dressed in elaborate robes and paraded before the Senate as living goddesses. Public ceremonies placed them at his side, sharing honors once reserved for the most sacred figures in Rome. The Senate was expected to rise, applaud, and offer praises as if they were watching a religious rite. No senator could refuse without risking execution. Silence was treason, applause was complicity. The effect was deliberate, by forcing Rome's leaders to openly approve what they privately despised. Caligula made their obedience visible to the entire city. Behind closed doors, the same divine logic justified his control over anyone he desired. If his bloodline was holy, then touching it, or being touched by it, was an act of worship. It was a philosophy that merged power, religion, and abuse into a single, unchallengeable system. And with the Senate conditioned to cheer what should have been unthinkable, Caligula was ready to stage one last spectacle. It would involve a victim chosen not for beauty or skill alone, but for the political message her suffering would send, and the father who would be forced to watch. Senator Gaius Varro now understood why he had been summoned for torch duty. His recent speech in the Senate against a new imperial tax had marked him for punishment. The choice of victim was deliberate. His only daughter, Livia, barely 15. She was taken from him at the palace gates, her eyes wide with confusion, while a guard pressed the familiar bronze torch into his hands. Led to the same sealed door he had seen before, Varro was positioned exactly 8 feet away, the torch raised to shoulder height. Through the narrow window, he could see the chamber within, lit perfectly by the flames he held. Livia was brought inside, dressed in garments that mocked modesty. Her gaze found his, a flicker of hope that he might intervene. Caligula's voice broke the tense silence. "She has your eyes, Senator," he said casually, without pausing in what he was doing. "I wonder if she will keep that same defiance after tonight." Varro's grip on the torch tightened until his knuckles ached. The guard at his side murmured a reminder. "Lower it, and your son joins her next week." At a small desk, a scribe calmly scratched notes into a ledger. Entry 412. Livia Varro. Reason for acquisition: paternal opposition to tax policy. Status in process. The quill did not stop even as the act continued. When it was over, Livia was led away without looking back. The scribe closed the book and said without emotion, "We'll see her again next month." The words carried further than the torchlight, reaching every senator who would hear of them by morning. Proof that opposing Caligula was not only futile, but dangerous to everything a man hoped to protect. Caligula's reign ended not with justice, but with self-preservation by those closest to him. On January 24th, 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard struck him down in a palace corridor. Their motive was not outrage at his crimes, but fear that his unpredictability threatened their own power and wealth. His death was quick, the systems he built were not. The ledgers remained in the archives. The guard stayed in place. The habits of obedience and silence he had forced into Rome's elite endured long after his body was gone. Families who had suffered under him rarely spoke of it, but the damage passed quietly from parent to child. Daughters who had been taken raised daughters who feared men. Sons who had been humiliated grew into fathers unable to protect. The empire had been trained to accept that survival sometimes meant complicity. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered physical proof of what the historians had recorded. Torch holders fixed into palace walls at precise intervals. Iron restraints still bolted to stone. Fragments of ledgers listing names reduced to numbers. These artifacts revealed a truth that monuments and marble inscriptions could not hide. The machinery of control outlived the man who designed it. The real horror was not that Caligula had died. It was that the system he perfected became a model for other tyrants, in other times, under other names. Some torches, once lit, never truly go out. They simply wait for the next hand willing to hold them steady.